Your baby isn't the problem. Your family is. That's what the doctor said as he stared at my ultrasound, his voice low enough that it barely carried across the room. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard him because I was 67 years old, and I hadn't been expecting anything unusual from a routine checkup, certainly not a warning that sounded like it belonged in someone else's life, not mine. Not Margaret Collins, who had spent the last 4 decades building a quiet, steady existence centered around her son and the home we shared. So I laughed softly and told him there must be some kind of mistake, but he didn't laugh back. He just looked at me with a kind of careful concern that made my chest tighten, and then he asked me a question that unsettled me even more. He asked, "Who came with you last time, Mrs. Collins?" And I remember blinking at him, confused, because I had driven myself to the clinic that morning, parked in the same spot I always used, walked in alone, checked in alone, and sat in the waiting room flipping through an outdated magazine until they called my name. So I told him exactly that I always came alone, and something shifted in his expression, something subtle but unmistakable, like he had just confirmed a suspicion he didn't want to have, and he turned his screen slightly away from me, as if reconsidering how much he should show me, but I leaned forward anyway, because by then I could feel it, that quiet ripple of something not quite right, the kind of feeling you get when a room you've known for years suddenly feels unfamiliar, and I said, "Doctor, is there a problem?" And he hesitated, just for a second, before saying, "There are records here indicating you've been in multiple times over the past 6 months." And I felt my hands go still in my lap, because that wasn't possible. I hadn't been to that clinic in over a year, not since my last annual checkup, and I told him that. I said, "That can't be right. I would remember." But he was already scrolling through something, his eyes scanning line after line. And then he turned the screen toward me just enough for me to see my own name typed neatly across the top of the file, Margaret Collins, followed by dates I didn't recognize and notes I had never heard. And beneath it all, a signature that looked exactly like mine. The same looping M, the same careful slant I had practiced for years. Only I hadn't written it. I knew I hadn't. And for a moment I just stared at it, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be true, and the doctor cleared his throat softly and said, "I think you should review this carefully." But I could barely hear him over the sudden rush of thoughts in my head, because if I hadn't signed those documents, then someone else had, someone who knew my name, my information, someone who had access, and without thinking I asked, "Can I get a copy of that file?" And he nodded, though he looked hesitant, like he understood this was bigger than a simple clerical error, and as I gathered my things and stood to leave, he added quietly, "Mrs. Collins, whatever is going on, you need to be cautious." And I remember smiling at him, the way I always did when I didn't want to make a scene, the way I had learned over years of keeping peace in my family. And I said, "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding." But even as I said it, I could feel something settling deep in my chest, something cold and steady, because misunderstandings don't come with forged signatures and medical histories you've never lived. And as I walked out of that office into the bright California afternoon, the sun felt harsher than it should have, the air too still, and I sat in my car for a long moment with the folder resting on my lap, staring at my name printed across the top of every page, and I thought about my son Daniel, about the way he had been avoiding eye contact lately, the way his conversations had grown shorter, more distracted, and then I thought about Rachel, my daughter-in-law, always so attentive, always so helpful, always the one who insisted on organizing my appointments, my paperwork, my schedule, saying it was easier that way, saying she just wanted to take care of me. And for the first time, a question formed in my mind that I couldn't push away, a question that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. As I finally started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, because if I hadn't been the one sitting in that clinic all those times, then who had been sitting in my place, signing my name, building a record of a life that wasn't mine? And more importantly, why would anyone go to that kind of trouble unless they were planning something much bigger, something I hadn't even begun to understand? I did not go home right away that afternoon, even though my body followed the familiar route out of the clinic parking lot and onto the main road, because my mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying every word the doctor had said and every line I had seen on that screen. And by the time I reached the first red light, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had turned pale. So I loosened my hands and forced myself to breathe slowly, the way I used to when Daniel was a boy and I needed to stay calm for his sake. But this was different. This was not a scraped knee or a missed homework assignment. This was something deliberate, something planned. And as the light turned green, I made a decision without fully thinking it through. I turned the car around and headed back toward the clinic, because I needed to see it again, not just a glimpse, not just a passing look. I needed to understand what I had just been shown, and when I walked back inside, the receptionist looked surprised but not suspicious, which told me something else was wrong, because if I had truly been there multiple times before, she should have recognized me. She should have greeted me with some familiarity, but instead she offered me the same polite smile she gives to every stranger, and I said quietly that I needed a full copy of my medical records, and she nodded, tapping at her keyboard, and then she asked, "Would you like them printed or emailed like last time?" And that single sentence made my stomach drop, because there should not have been a last time, not one I could not remember, and I said printed, my voice steady even though something inside me was shifting, and as I waited, I looked around the waiting room with new eyes, noticing details I had overlooked. Before, the placement of the chairs, the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint scent of antiseptic, all of it felt strangely unfamiliar, as if I were seeing it for the first time, and yet being told I had been there many times. And when she finally handed me the thick envelope, I thanked her and walked back out to my car, but I did not start the engine this time. I just sat there and opened the file on my lap, page by page, slowly, carefully, and the more I read, the clearer it became that this was not a simple error. There were notes about conversations I had never had, decisions I had never made, even discussions about my long-term care, phrases like family consent and recommended transition plan. And every entry was signed with my name, every date aligned in a pattern that suggested regular visits, as if someone had been building a narrative over time, a story about my health, my capacity, my future, and then I reached a page that made everything else fade for a moment. It was a consent form, and beneath my printed name was a signature identical to mine, followed by a witness line that read Rachel Collins, and I felt something settle into place inside my mind. Not panic, not even anger, but a kind of quiet clarity, because suddenly the pieces I had been ignoring for months began to align, the way Rachel had insisted on handling my paperwork, the way she would say, "It is just routine, Margaret, just sign here," the way Daniel would stand nearby, distracted, trusting her without question, and I had signed those papers. I remembered signing something, but I had never read them closely. I had trusted her. I had trusted both of them. And now I was looking at the result of that trust, documented in black ink across page after page, and I closed the file slowly, resting my hands on top of it, because I needed to think, not react, not yet. And as I sat there, another detail surfaced, something small but sharp, the doctor's question, "Who came with you last time?" And I realized he had not been asking casually. He had been testing something, confirming something, which meant he suspected that the person attending those visits was not me, and that meant there had to be some kind of record beyond these papers, something visual, something that could not be explained away by a signature alone. And that thought stayed with me as I finally drove home. The late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the driveway as I pulled in, and through the front window, I could see Rachel moving around the kitchen, her silhouette familiar, her movements calm and practiced, the picture of someone who belonged there. And for a moment, I watched her from the car, remembering how grateful I had been when Daniel married her, how I had believed she would bring stability and warmth into his life, into our home, and I felt a brief, almost instinctive urge to walk inside and ask her directly, to hold up the papers and demand an explanation. But I did not, because something in me understood that whatever this was, it was not something she would admit to easily, and more importantly, it was not something I could afford to confront without understanding completely. So I took a deep breath, gathered the file, and stepped out of the car, smoothing my expression into something neutral, something unreadable, the same calm face I had worn for years. And when I opened the front door, Rachel turned toward me with a bright smile and said, "You are home early. How was your appointment?" And I met her eyes, holding her gaze for just a second longer than usual, and then I smiled back and said, "Everything was fine." Because for now, that was the truth I needed her to believe. That evening felt exactly like every other evening I had lived through in that house, and yet nothing about it felt the same anymore. Because once you see something clearly, you cannot unsee it. And as I stood in the kitchen beside Rachel, watching her stir a pot of soup with slow, steady movements, I found myself noticing things I had overlooked for years. The way she positioned herself between me and the counter where the mail usually sat. The way she casually reached for my purse when she thought I was not paying attention. The way her smile lingered just a moment too long when she asked simple questions. And I realized that what I had once interpreted as care might have been something else entirely. Something more controlled, more deliberate, and I kept my voice even as I set my keys down and said, "The doctor said everything looked fine." And she nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if that was exactly what she had expected to hear. And then she said, "That is good, Margaret. We just want to make sure you are taking care of yourself." And I heard the words, but I also heard what was underneath them. That subtle tone of management, of oversight. As if my life had quietly shifted from being my own to being something they supervised. And when Daniel came home a few minutes later, he greeted me with a distracted hug, his mind clearly elsewhere, his phone still in his hand as he checked a message even while asking how my day had been. And I answered in the same way I always did, calmly, simply, because I needed to see more before I said anything. And we sat down to dinner together, the three of us at the same table we had used for years, the same plates, the same chairs, the same routine, and yet there was a distance I had never felt so sharply before, because now every glance, every pause, every word carried a different weight, and I noticed how Daniel avoided meeting my eyes whenever Rachel spoke about plans, how he nodded along to whatever she suggested without question, and when she mentioned needing to review some documents with me later that week, he did not even ask what kind of documents, he just agreed, as if it was already understood that she handled those things, and I felt a quiet realization settle deeper inside me, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady and undeniable, that this had not started recently. This had been building for a long time, layer by layer, decision by decision, until I had been gently moved out of control of my own life without ever noticing the exact moment it happened. And after dinner, when Rachel began clearing the table, she turned to me and said, "Margaret, I found some paperwork we need to update, just routine things. I can bring them to you tomorrow." And I looked at her, really looked at her, at the calm confidence in her expression, at the expectation that I would simply agree the way I always had. And I smiled softly and said, "That sounds fine," because I wanted her to continue. I wanted her to believe that nothing had changed, that I was still the same trusting woman she thought she had been managing all this time. And later that night, after they had both gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room with the folder from the clinic spread out in front of me, reading each page again more carefully, more slowly, and this time I began to notice patterns I had missed before. The dates of the visits aligned with days when Rachel had insisted on handling errands for me. The notes referenced conversations about my memory, my decision-making, my ability to manage finances, all framed in a way that suggested concern, but also control, as if someone had been carefully documenting a version of me that was less capable, more dependent, someone who might eventually need assistance, supervision, even relocation. And I felt a chill run through me as I understood what that meant, because medical records do not exist in isolation. They are used, referenced, trusted, and if someone were building a record that suggested I could not manage my own affairs, it would not take much for that record to be used to justify decisions about my life, decisions I might not even be aware of until it was too late. And I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment, letting that realization settle fully, because fear would not help me now, reaction would not help me. What I needed was clarity, patience, and evidence. And when I opened my eyes again, I reached for my phone and scrolled through my recent calls, my appointments, my messages, looking for anything that might connect to what I had seen. And there it was, small but unmistakable, reminders that Rachel had set for me, confirmations I did not remember making, notifications that had seemed harmless at the time, but now felt like part of something larger, something structured. And I understood then that if I wanted to know the full truth, I would have to step back, observe, and let them continue, because people reveal more when they believe they are not being watched. And as I gathered the papers and carefully placed them back into the folder, I made a quiet decision, not spoken, not shared, but firm in a way I had not felt in years, that I would not confront them yet. I would not accuse or question. I would simply watch, listen, and wait. Because whatever Rachel had started, whatever she thought she was building, she believed she was in control, and for now, I was going to let her keep believing that. The next morning began like any other, quiet and predictable, the soft hum of the coffee maker filling the kitchen as the early light filtered through the curtains, and I moved through my routine with the same steady rhythm I had followed for years. But beneath that routine something had shifted, something sharper, more aware, and when Rachel walked in, already dressed and composed, she smiled at me the same way she always did, warm and effortless, and said, "Good morning, Margaret, I was just about to bring you those documents I mentioned." And I returned her smile, setting my cup down carefully as if nothing at all had changed, and said, "Of course, that would be fine." Because I needed to see what she would put in front of me, needed to understand how far this had gone, and she disappeared briefly down the hallway before returning with a neat stack of papers clipped together, placing them on the table in front of me with a practiced ease that suggested she had done this many times before, and she said, "These are just updates, nothing complicated. We just need to keep everything current." And I glanced down at the top page, recognizing immediately the structure of a form that carried more weight than she was suggesting. Words like authorization, consent, and management appearing in clean, official type, and I felt that quiet clarity return, steady and grounding, because now I could see it happening in real time, not just in past records. And I picked up the pen she had placed beside the papers, turning it slowly between my fingers as if considering something simple, and I said, "What exactly are these for?" Keeping my tone light, curious, the way I always had, and she leaned slightly closer, her voice soft, reassuring, as she explained, "It is just to make things easier, Margaret. In case you ever need help with appointments or finances, it allows us to act on your behalf, if necessary." And I nodded slowly, as if that made perfect sense, as if I had not already read pages of evidence showing what that permission had already been used for, and I said, "That sounds reasonable." And for a moment I saw something in her expression, a brief flicker of satisfaction, quickly hidden but unmistakable now that I was looking for it, and I lowered my gaze back to the papers, scanning the lines more carefully this time, reading each word, each clause, and there it was, buried beneath the language of convenience and care, a transfer of authority that would allow someone else to make decisions in my name, decisions about my health, my finances, my living arrangements, all framed as protection, all presented as help, and I felt no panic as I read it, no rush of emotion, just that same calm awareness growing stronger, because now there was no doubt left, this was intentional, structured, and ongoing, and I set the pen down gently without signing, looking up at her with a small, thoughtful smile and saying, "You know, I think I would like to have my lawyer take a look at this first, just to be sure I understand everything." And the change in her expression was subtle but immediate, the warmth tightening just slightly at the edges, the ease replaced by something more controlled, and she said, "There is really no need for that, Margaret. It is all standard." But I shook my head gently, still smiling, still calm, and said, "I am sure it is, but I would feel better if I reviewed it properly." And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just enough to make the shift between us undeniable. And then she nodded, though the smile she offered did not quite reach her eyes, and said, "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable." And I gathered the papers neatly, stacking them together with care, as if they were exactly what she claimed them to be, routine, harmless, and I stood, carrying them with me as I left the kitchen, feeling her gaze follow me down the hallway. And when I closed the door to my room, I did not sit down right away. I just stood there for a moment, holding the documents in my hands, letting the weight of them settle, because this was no longer about suspicion or uncertainty. This was confirmation, and as I placed the papers on my desk beside the medical file from the day before, the two stacks aligned in a way that made the pattern unmistakable, one built quietly over time, the other presented openly under the guise of care, both leading toward the same outcome, and I sat down slowly, opening the new documents again, reading them line by line, not as someone being guided, but as someone observing, analyzing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something return to me that I had not realized I had lost, a sense of control, not over the situation yet, but over my understanding of it, and I reached for my phone, scrolling until I found the number I had not used in years, a contact saved under a simple name, Patricia, the attorney who had once helped my husband with his business, someone who understood documents like these, someone who would see what I was seeing without needing it explained. And I paused with my finger over the screen for just a second before pressing call, listening to the line ring as I looked down at the papers spread out before me. And when she answered, her voice familiar and steady, I said, "Patricia, this is Margaret Collins. I think I need your help. Because whatever Rachel believed she was building, whatever story she thought she was writing in my name, she was not the only one paying attention anymore." Patricia did not ask many questions on the phone, which was one of the reasons I had trusted her years ago when my husband was still alive. She simply listened as I described what I had found, the medical records, the signatures, the documents Rachel had placed in front of me that morning, and when I finished there was a brief pause on the line before she said, very calmly, "Margaret, I need you to bring everything to my office. Do not sign anything else, and do not tell anyone what you know." And there was something in her tone that confirmed what I had already begun to understand, that this was not a misunderstanding, not a simple mistake. And as I agreed and ended the call, I felt that same steady clarity settle deeper into place, because now I was not alone in seeing it. And I spent the next hour gathering every piece of paper I could find, not just the files from the clinic and the documents Rachel had given me, but also older records, bank statements, letters, anything that might connect to what had been happening without my full awareness. And as I moved quietly through the house, I noticed how carefully everything had been arranged, how certain drawers contained exactly what I would expect to find, while others felt oddly curated, as if someone had already decided what I should and should not have access to. And I did not disturb anything more than necessary. I simply collected what I needed and placed it neatly into a folder, the same way I had done for years when organizing family paperwork. Except this time I was not preparing for taxes or routine updates. I was preparing to understand what had been done in my name. And when I left the house, I told Rachel I had an appointment, which was not unusual. She often encouraged me to stay busy, and she smiled and reminded me to take the documents with me, as if she expected them to return. Signed, and I nodded, holding the folder close as I walked out, because in a way she was right. I was taking them with me, just not for the reason she believed, and Patricia's office had not changed much over the years. The same quiet reception area, the same neutral tones, the same sense of order and control. And when she came out to greet me, she did not waste time with pleasantries. She led me straight into her office, closed the door, and gestured for me to sit, and I placed the folder on her desk, sliding it toward her, and she opened it immediately, her eyes moving quickly but carefully over each page. And the room remained silent except for the soft sound of paper turning, and I watched her face as she read, not for emotion, because she did not show much of that, but for recognition, for confirmation. And after several minutes she leaned back slightly, folding her hands together, and said, "Margaret, this is very serious." And I nodded, because I already knew that, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a different way. And she continued, "Someone has been establishing a legal and medical narrative about your capacity, your decision-making, and your need for assistance, and they have been doing it consistently over time." And I felt no surprise at that point, only a quiet tightening in my chest as the pattern was named, and I asked, "What does that mean?" And she answered without hesitation, "It means that if this continues, they could attempt to gain legal control over your affairs, possibly through a conservatorship or similar arrangement. Especially if they can present documentation suggesting you are no longer able to manage things independently." And I let that sink in, not rushing it, because understanding required space. And I thought about the language in the medical records, the way it framed me as forgetful, uncertain, in need of guidance, and I saw how easily that narrative could be extended, reinforced, and eventually used. And Patricia reached for one of the documents Rachel had given me that morning, tapping lightly on a section near the bottom, and said, "These forms are part of that process. They would give someone authority to act on your behalf, and once signed, they can be very difficult to reverse." And I looked at the page again, at the clean lines of text that had seemed so harmless just hours before, and I said quietly, "She wanted me to sign them today." And Patricia nodded, not surprised, and said, "Of course she did." And there was no judgment in her voice, only certainty. And for a moment we sat in silence, the weight of the situation fully present, and then she leaned forward slightly and said, "The good news is that you have not signed them, and that gives us room to act. But we need to move carefully, because whoever is doing this believes they are close to completing something, and that means they may become more aggressive if they sense resistance." And I understood that immediately, because I had already seen how controlled and deliberate Rachel's approach had been, and I said, "What should I do?" And Patricia's answer was simple, clear, and steady. "For now, you do exactly what you have been doing. You remain calm. You do not confront them. And you let them believe everything is proceeding as expected, while we begin to secure your position, your assets, and your authority." And I felt something shift inside me again. Not fear, not even anger, but something stronger, something more focused, because this was no longer just about understanding what had happened. It was about deciding what would happen next. And as I left her office later that afternoon, the folder now organized with careful notes and markers, I realized that the quiet life I had been living was no longer what it appeared to be, and that the trust one had given so freely had been used in ways I had never imagined. But I also realized something else, something just as important, that the story they had been writing about me was not finished yet, and that meant I still had time to change how it ended. When I walked back into the house that evening, nothing looked different. The same soft lighting in the living room, the same quiet hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, the same familiar scent of lavender Rachel liked to use, and yet I could feel the difference in myself immediately, because I was no longer moving through that space unaware. I was observing it, measuring it, noticing the small details that had once blended into the background, and Rachel was sitting at the table with her laptop open, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. And when she looked up and saw me, she smiled in that same warm, practiced way and said, "How did your appointment go?" And I returned the smile easily, setting my bag down as if the day had been entirely ordinary, and I said, "It went well, just routine," because that was what she expected to hear. And for now, expectations were something I intended to use, not disrupt, and she nodded, satisfied, turning her attention back to the screen. And I noticed the way she angled it slightly away from me, a small movement, almost instinctive, but now impossible to ignore, and I walked past her into the kitchen, placing the folder Patricia had organized carefully into a drawer that I knew Rachel rarely checked, not hiding it in a way that would draw attention, but placing it somewhere neutral, somewhere it belonged, because the last thing I wanted was to signal that anything had changed. And as I moved through the evening, I followed my usual routine with quiet precision, preparing tea, folding a few towels, listening to the low murmur of the television in the background, all the while keeping my awareness focused, noting how often Rachel checked her phone, how often Daniel glanced at her before responding to me, how conversations seemed to pass through her before reaching me. And it was not dramatic, not obvious, but once seen, it was unmistakable. And later, when we sat down together, Rachel brought up the documents again, her tone light, almost casual, as she said, "Did you get a chance to look at those forms?" And I took a slow sip of tea before answering, giving myself just enough time to choose my words carefully, and I said, "I started to, but I think I would like to review them a bit more. Maybe tomorrow." And she nodded, though I could see the calculation behind her expression, the quick adjustment, the reassessment, and she said, "Of course, take your time." But there was a subtle shift in her tone, something tighter, more controlled, and Daniel glanced between us briefly, as if sensing something but not quite understanding it, and I met his eyes with the same calm expression I had always used, the one that reassured him without requiring explanation, because whatever role he was playing in this, whether he was aware or simply following, I needed him to remain exactly where he was for now. And that night, after they had gone upstairs, I did not go to bed right away. Instead, I sat at the dining table with a small notebook Patricia had suggested I keep, and I began to write, not in long sentences or explanations, but in short, precise observations, dates, times, small details that might not seem important on their own, but together could form a clear picture, the kind of record that could not be dismissed or rewritten. And as I wrote, I felt that sense of control strengthening, because information has a way of shifting power, even when nothing else has changed yet. And over the next few days, I continued in the same way, calm, consistent, observant, I followed my routine, responded as expected, allowed Rachel to continue presenting her version of care, while quietly noting every instance where decisions were suggested, every time paperwork appeared, every conversation that hinted at something more than it claimed to be, and I began to see the pattern more clearly, not just in the documents, but in the rhythm of daily life, how certain topics were introduced gradually, how language was softened to make significant changes seem small, how my independence was framed as something that needed gentle support, and all of it pointed in the same direction, toward a future where my role would be reduced, my authority transferred, my voice less central in decisions about my own life. And one afternoon, as I was sorting through the mail, I found something that made me pause, a letter addressed to me from a financial institution I recognized, but one I had not personally contacted in years, and I opened it carefully, reading the contents slowly, and there it was again, the same language, polite, professional, confirming recent activity, updates to account permissions, and my name printed neatly at the top, as if I had authorized it myself. And I felt that same quiet clarity settle over me, because now the scope of what had been happening was expanding beyond medical records, beyond a single set of documents. It was systematic, connected, and as I folded the letter and placed it into my folder, I understood that whatever Rachel had planned was not limited to one area of my life. It was comprehensive, structured to appear reasonable at every step. And I stood there for a moment, holding that realization, not with fear, but with a kind of steady resolve, because the more I saw, the clearer my next steps became. And as I walked back into the living room, Rachel looked up from her laptop again, her expression attentive, watchful, and she said, "Everything okay?" And I met her gaze, calm and composed, and said, "Yes, everything is fine," because for now that was still the truth she needed to believe, even as the story she thought she was controlling was beginning to shift in ways she could not yet see. By the end of that week, the house had not changed, but the rhythm of it had, at least for me, because every movement, every word, every glance now carried meaning, and I found myself anticipating patterns before they fully formed, noticing how Rachel's tone shifted when she spoke about plans, how Daniel deferred without thinking, how decisions were introduced gently, almost invisibly. And one evening, as we sat together after dinner, Rachel closed her laptop with a soft click and said, "Margaret, I was thinking it might be a good idea to schedule a follow-up with your doctor next week, just to stay ahead of things." And I looked at her calmly, setting my teacup down with deliberate care, and said, "That is interesting, because I was just there recently." And she smiled, not missing a beat, and replied, "Yes, but regular monitoring is important, especially at this stage." And there it was again, that phrasing, that quiet implication that something about me required oversight, and I nodded slowly, as if considering it, while in my mind I noted the timing, the consistency, the way these suggestions aligned with the records I had already seen. And I said, "I will think about it," and she accepted that answer with a slight tilt of her head, though I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the adjustment, the shift in approach, and Daniel, sitting beside her, simply nodded, as if the suggestion had come from a place of unquestionable reason, and I realized then that whatever Rachel had been building, Daniel had become part of it, whether through trust or habit or something more deliberate, I could not yet say, but his role was no longer neutral. And later that night, when the house had grown quiet, I returned to my notebook, adding new observations, noting the language Rachel used, the frequency of her suggestions, the way certain topics reappeared with increasing regularity, and as I wrote, a clearer picture began to form, not just of what had been done, but of what was coming next, because patterns do not exist without direction, and this one was moving steadily toward a point where my independence would be questioned openly, where decisions would be justified using the very records I had never created. And the next morning, I decided to test something, not in a confrontational way, but in a way that would reveal more. And when Rachel mentioned again that we should review the documents together, I smiled and said, "Actually, I spoke with Patricia, my lawyer, and she suggested I take some time before signing anything." And the reaction was immediate, subtle but unmistakable. Rachel's expression tightened for just a fraction of a second before smoothing back into place, and she said, "Oh, I did not realize you had involved a lawyer, Margaret. That seems a bit unnecessary." and I held her gaze, calm and steady, and replied, "I prefer to be thorough." And Daniel looked between us, his expression uncertain now, as if something had shifted in a way he could not quite interpret. And Rachel nodded slowly, her tone still controlled but now carrying an edge I had not heard before, and she said, "Of course, if that makes you comfortable." And in that moment, I understood something important, that the moment I stepped outside the structure she had created, even slightly, it disrupted her expectations, and disruption, even small, forced adjustment. And adjustment revealed intention. And over the next few days, those adjustments became more visible. Rachel's suggestions became more frequent, more detailed, as if she was trying to guide things back into alignment. And Daniel's role shifted as well. He began to ask more questions, though they were directed at Rachel rather than at me, seeking reassurance rather than clarity. And I watched it all unfold with the same calm attention I had maintained, because now I was not just observing what had already happened. I was observing how they responded when the plan encountered resistance. And one afternoon, as I was organizing a drawer in the study, I heard Rachel on the phone in the next room, her voice low but clear enough for certain words to carry, words like timeline, documents, and approval. And I did not move closer. I did not interrupt. I simply remained where I was, listening without appearing to listen, because sometimes what is not meant for you to hear tells you more than anything said directly. And when she finished the call and stepped into the hallway, she paused. When she saw me, just for a moment, before offering that same composed smile and asking if I needed anything. And I shook my head lightly and said, "No, everything is fine." And she nodded, though her eyes lingered on me a second longer than usual, as if reassessing, recalculating. And I realized then that the balance between us had begun to shift, not dramatically, not in a way that could be named outright, but in a way that was undeniable if you knew what to look for, because she was no longer entirely certain of her position, and I was no longer the person she believed she was managing. And that quiet shift, that subtle change in awareness and control, was the first real indication that whatever she had started, whatever she thought she had secured, was not as certain as she had believed. The following days unfolded with a quiet precision that even I had not expected, because once a plan begins to take shape, it reveals its own rhythm, and I found myself moving within that rhythm carefully, deliberately, making small adjustments that would not draw attention but would begin to change the foundation beneath everything Rachel had been building. And the first step was simple, almost invisible. I returned to Patricia's office with the new information, the letter from the bank, the notes I had been keeping, the observations that had started as scattered details and were now forming a consistent pattern. And she reviewed everything with the same calm focus she had shown before, occasionally making a note, occasionally asking a question that helped clarify the timeline. And when she finished, she looked at me and said, "Margaret, we need to act before they do." And there was no urgency in her tone, only certainty, and she began outlining the steps. Not dramatic, not confrontational, but effective. Changes to account permissions, notifications placed on financial institutions, legal documentation reinforcing my authority over my own affairs, all of it structured in a way that would not alert Rachel immediately, but would prevent further changes from being made without my direct involvement. And I listened carefully, asking only what was necessary, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about positioning. And when I left her office that day, I carried with me not just a folder of documents, but a sense of direction, clear and steady. And over the next few days, I followed that direction with the same quiet consistency I had used to observe, visiting the bank under the pretense of routine matters, confirming my identity, updating my preferences, ensuring that no changes could be processed without my direct authorization. And each step felt small on its own, but together they formed something stronger, something protective. And when I returned home each time, I resumed my usual routine without interruption, speaking with Rachel and Daniel as I always had, responding calmly, offering no indication that anything had shifted beneath the surface. And I could see that Rachel was adjusting as well, her approach becoming more deliberate, her questions more frequent, as if she was trying to determine how much control remained where she expected it to be. And one evening, as we sat together in the living room, she said, "Margaret, I think it would be helpful if we scheduled a meeting with your doctor and perhaps a specialist, just to make sure we are covering everything." and I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the suggestion, while in my mind I noted the escalation, the shift from suggestion to coordination, and I said, "That might be useful," keeping my tone neutral, because agreement, in this case, did not mean compliance, it meant continuation. And continuation meant opportunity, and later that night, as I sat alone again, with my notebook, I reviewed everything that had happened, the records, the documents, the conversations, the subtle shifts in behavior, and I saw the structure clearly now, not just the actions, but the intention behind them, the careful construction of a narrative that positioned me as someone in need of guidance, someone whose decisions required oversight. And I understood that the next phase of that plan would likely involve formalizing that narrative, presenting it in a way that would appear reasonable to others, and that meant I needed more than observation. I needed evidence that could not be dismissed, and the following morning, I returned to the clinic, not as a patient, but as someone seeking clarity, and I requested access to the full history of visits associated with my name, including any supporting documentation, and the staff, following their procedures, provided what they could. And as I reviewed it there, in that same quiet waiting room, I found what I had been expecting: additional forms, additional signatures, and most importantly, a reference to recorded check-ins, security logs that documented who had entered the facility and when, and I felt that same steady clarity deepen, because this was something that could be verified, something that existed outside of paperwork. And when I asked about those logs, the receptionist explained that they were maintained for security purposes and could be accessed through proper request, and I thanked her, making a note of the process, because now I knew where to look next. And when I left the clinic, the afternoon light felt the same as it had before, but I did not feel the same within it, because the uncertainty that had marked those first moments had been replaced by something else entirely, something quieter but far more solid. And as I drove home, I thought about Rachel, about the careful way she had constructed her version of events, about the confidence she carried when she believed everything was under control, and I realized that confidence was based on one assumption: that I would not see what she was doing, that I would not question it, that I would continue to sign, to agree, to follow. And as I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile, because that assumption was no longer true. And while she continued to move forward with her plan, believing it was intact, I was now moving just as carefully, just as deliberately, building something of my own, something she had not anticipated. And when I stepped inside, Rachel looked up from the kitchen, her expression attentive, her voice light as she asked how my day had been, and I met her gaze, calm and composed, and said, "It was productive," because for the first time since all of this had begun, that was entirely true. The next step came together more naturally than I expected, not because it was easy, but because everything I had seen so far pointed toward a single conclusion: that Rachel's plan depended on documentation, on records that appeared consistent and unquestioned. And if I could challenge even one part of that structure with something undeniable, something objective, it would begin to unravel in ways she could not easily repair. And with that in mind, I returned to the clinic once more, this time following the exact process the receptionist had mentioned, submitting a formal request for access to the security logs associated with my visits. And I kept my tone polite, my explanation simple, because there was no need to complicate what was, on the surface, a routine inquiry. And while I waited for the request to be processed, I sat in the same waiting area where I had first felt that quiet unease. Only now the feeling was different, not uncertainty, but anticipation, because I knew what I was looking for. And when the staff member finally returned with the information they were able to provide, it was not a complete file, but it was enough: a list of dates and times, entries tied to the visits recorded under my name. And as I reviewed it, my eyes moved slowly across each line, matching the dates to the records I had already seen. And then I noticed a pattern in the timing. The visits often occurred during hours when I was at home, following my usual routine, and I felt that same steady clarity deepen, because this was no longer just about forged signatures. This was about physical presence, about someone else occupying a space that had been assigned to me. And I asked, as casually as I could, whether there were any visual records associated with those entries. And the staff member explained that security footage was stored for a Limited time, but that certain logs could be reviewed with proper authorization, and I nodded, making note of the next step, because even without the footage itself, the existence of those logs was significant. It created a discrepancy that could not be easily explained away. And when I left the clinic, I did not rush. I did not react outwardly. I simply drove home the same way I always did, the familiar streets, the same turns, the same quiet neighborhood, and yet everything felt sharper, more defined, because now I was no longer gathering fragments. I was connecting them. And when I walked into the house, Rachel was in the kitchen again, her movement smooth, her expression composed, and she looked up with that same attentive smile and said, "You have been out quite a bit lately. Margaret, everything all right?" And I met her gaze calmly, placing my keys down with the same measured motion I had practiced, and I said, "Just taking care of a few things," because that was the truth, even if it was not the truth she expected, and she nodded, though I could see the question behind her eyes, the subtle shift in her posture, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just enough to acknowledge that something had changed, even if it had not been named. And then she turned back to what she was doing, the conversation moving on as if nothing had happened, but I knew that she was watching more closely now, just as I was. And that evening, as we sat together, Daniel brought up the idea of reviewing finances, something he had never initiated before, and his tone was hesitant, almost rehearsed, as he said, "Mom, Rachel and I were thinking it might be helpful to go over everything, just to make sure things are organized." And I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not just my son, but the position he now occupied within this situation, and I smiled gently, the same way I had when he was younger, and said, "That sounds like a good idea. We should definitely do that." And Rachel glanced at him, then at me, her expression briefly unreadable before settling back into that familiar calm. And I realized that this was the moment where their plan was beginning to move into its next phase, the part where everything would be presented more openly, more directly, supported by the records they believed were secure, and I allowed it to continue, because interruption at this stage would only alert them, while continuation would reveal more. And later that night, as I sat once again with my notebook and the growing collection of documents, I added the new information, the security logs, the timing discrepancies, the conversations that hinted at what was coming next, and as I wrote, I could see the structure of their plan clearly now, not just the steps they had taken, but the direction they were heading, toward a point where they would present a complete, consistent narrative, one that justified every action they had already begun. And I closed the notebook slowly, resting my hand on top of it for a moment, because this was no longer about discovering what had happened. It was about preparing for what would happen next. And as I turned off the light and made my way upstairs, the house was quiet, the same quiet it had always been, but I understood now that beneath that quiet, two different plans were unfolding at the same time. One built on assumption, on control, on the belief that I would not see, and the other built on awareness, on patience, on the understanding that seeing clearly is the first step to changing everything. And as I reached my room and closed the door behind me, I knew that the next time we all sat down together to review anything, it would not unfold the way Rachel expected, because the story she had been writing was about to meet something she had not accounted for, the truth that could no longer be shaped by her alone. The moment came sooner than I expected, not because they rushed it, but because everything had already been set in motion, long before I became aware of it. And it happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon when Rachel suggested we all sit down together to go over a few things, her tone light, almost casual, as if this was just another routine conversation. And Daniel agreed quickly, setting his phone aside and taking a seat at the dining table, his posture attentive but slightly tense, and I followed them, carrying nothing with me except the calm I had been building for days, because this was not a moment for reaction. This was a moment for clarity, and Rachel placed a neat stack of papers on the table between us, aligning them carefully before looking at me with that same composed expression and saying, "Margaret, we just want to make sure everything is organized moving forward. It is really for your benefit." And I nodded slowly, as if I had heard this many times before, which in a way I had. And I said, "Of course, let us take a look." And she began explaining each document with practiced ease, her voice steady, her words chosen carefully to frame everything as supportive, necessary, responsible, and Daniel added occasional comments, reinforcing her explanations without fully engaging with the details, as if he trusted her interpretation more than the documents themselves. And I listened without interrupting, allowing the explanation to unfold completely, because what mattered now was not what they said, but what they believed I would accept. And when she reached the final document, the one that would grant broader authority over my financial and medical decisions, she paused slightly, her eyes meeting mine with a quiet expectation, and she said, "This is just to ensure we can help you if anything comes up. It is really just a precaution." And I looked down at the page, recognizing every word, every clause, every implication, and I let a moment pass before I spoke. Just enough time for the weight of the situation to settle fully into the room. And then I said, calmly and clearly, "Before I sign anything, there is something I would like to understand." And Rachel's expression remained composed, but I saw the shift, the slight tightening at the corners of her eyes, the subtle alertness that replaced her earlier confidence. And she said, "Of course. What is it?" And I reached into my bag and placed a single document on the table, sliding it toward her with a steady hand. And it was one of the medical records, the one with my name printed at the top and the signature that looked exactly like mine. And I said, "Can you explain this?" And for a brief moment, the room was completely still, the kind of silence that does not need to be acknowledged because it speaks for itself. And Rachel glanced down at the paper, then back at me, her expression carefully neutral, and she said, "That looks like your medical file, Margaret. I do not see the issue." And I nodded slightly, as if that answer was expected, and I said, "The issue is that I was not there." And Daniel shifted in his seat, his attention sharpening, his gaze moving between us as if trying to understand what he had just heard. And Rachel's composure held, but only just, and she said, "What do you mean?" And I placed another document on the table, the security log entries, aligning them beside the medical record, and I said, "These visits occurred at times when I was at home, and yet my name, my signature, and my consent appear on every page." And Daniel leaned forward now, his confusion evident, and Rachel's silence stretched a second longer than before, and in that second, everything that had been carefully constructed began to shift, not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden confrontation, but with the quiet introduction of something that could not be easily explained. And I continued, my voice steady, my tone unchanged. "I would like to understand how that is possible." And Rachel finally spoke, her voice still controlled but now carrying a tension that had not been there before. And she said, "There must be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe the clinic made an error." And I held her gaze, not accusing, not emotional, just present. And I said, "That is what I thought at first, but the records are consistent, and the signatures are identical, which suggests something more deliberate." And Daniel looked at Rachel now, his expression no longer neutral, his trust beginning to fracture under the weight of what he was hearing. And for the first time since this began, the balance in the room had shifted completely, because the narrative Rachel had been building depended on assumption, on quiet acceptance, and now it was being met with something else, something clear, documented, and impossible to ignore. And I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her directly. I simply placed the evidence in front of her and allowed it to exist, because sometimes the most powerful response is not confrontation, but clarity. And as the silence settled again, heavier this time, I realized that this was the moment everything changed, not because I had taken control openly, but because I had shown that I was no longer part of the story they thought they were telling. And whatever came next, whatever explanation Rachel would attempt, whatever realization Daniel would reach, it would not unfold the way they had planned, because the foundation they had relied on was no longer secure, and they both knew it. Daniel did not speak right away, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said, because I had known my son all his life. I had seen him in moments of certainty and moments of doubt, and the way he looked at Rachel now was different. It was not the quiet agreement he had shown before. It was something unsettled, something searching, and Rachel must have seen it too, because her posture shifted slightly, her shoulders straightening, her expression tightening just enough to reveal the effort it took to maintain control. And she reached for the papers on the table as if to reframe the situation, to bring it back into the structure she had carefully built. And she said, "Margaret, I think we are getting off track here. These documents are about making sure everything is handled properly moving forward. And her tone was calm, measured, almost reassuring, but it no longer carried the same weight. Not after what had already been placed in front of her, and I did not interrupt her. I allowed her to speak, because I wanted Daniel to hear it, to compare it to what he had just seen. And when she finished, I simply rested my hands lightly on the table and said, I agree that things should be handled properly. That is exactly why I brought this up. And my voice remained steady, not confrontational, not emotional, just clear, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his gaze moving between the documents, his brow furrowed in a way I had not seen in years, and he said, Rachel, how could this happen? And the question hung in the air, not accusatory, but uncertain, as if he was still trying to find a version of events that made sense within the trust he had placed in her. And Rachel did not answer immediately, which in itself was an answer, because she was someone who always had a response, always had an explanation ready. And the absence of one now created a space that could not be easily filled. And when she finally spoke, her voice was still controlled. But the edges had changed, the confidence now layered with something else, and she said, It could be an administrative issue. Daniel, you know how these systems can be. And he nodded slowly, but the movement lacked conviction, and I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the beginning of a shift he had not yet fully accepted, and I reached into my bag again, this time placing the letter from the bank on the table beside the other documents, aligning it carefully so that all three pieces formed a clear sequence, and I said, The clinic suggested the same thing at first, but then I found this, and Daniel picked it up, reading it more carefully than he had read anything else that afternoon. And as his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed again, the confusion giving way to something sharper, more focused, and he looked up at Rachel, not with accusation, but with a question that no longer had an easy answer. And in that moment, the balance in the room shifted completely, because what had once been an assumption, an unspoken agreement that Rachel managed these things correctly, was now being replaced by uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of opening doors that certainty keeps closed, and Rachel could feel it. I could see it in the way she adjusted her posture, in the way her hands rested more firmly on the table, in the way her gaze moved between us as if recalculating, and she said, I have been handling things for your mother because she asked me to, because it was easier for her. And there it was, the first step away from denial, not a full admission, but a shift in framing, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without confirming it, and I said, I do not recall asking for that kind of help, and my tone remained the same, calm, steady, because this was not about proving her wrong through emotion, it was about allowing the facts to stand on their own, and Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes no longer avoiding mine, and I saw something in his expression that had been missing before, recognition, not complete, not comfortable, but present. And he said quietly, Mom, did you know about any of this? And I met his gaze, holding it for a moment before answering, and I said, No, I did not. And the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than anything else I could have added, because it removed the possibility of misunderstanding. It placed the situation exactly where it belonged, and for a moment, no one spoke, the silence settling again. But this time it felt different, not controlled, not managed, but open, uncertain, and I could see that Rachel understood it too, that the structure she had relied on was no longer intact, that the narrative she had been building was no longer accepted without question, and she said, more quietly now, I was just trying to help, and I looked at her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a kind of calm clarity that had taken me days to reach, and I said, Help does not require someone else's signature, and the words were simple, but they carried everything that needed to be said, and Daniel closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing that, as if placing it into a context he had not considered before, and when he opened them again, he looked at Rachel differently, not with trust, not with certainty, but with a question that could not be answered by explanation alone, and I realized then that whatever came next, whatever decisions would be made after this conversation, the foundation had already shifted. Because once trust is questioned, it does not return to its original form. It becomes something else, something that requires proof, and proof, once introduced, cannot be undone. And as I sat there, calm and steady. I understood that I had not needed to raise my voice. I had not needed to argue. All I had needed to do was bring the truth into the room and allow it to exist, because the truth, when seen clearly, changes everything on its own. The silence that followed did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like something settling into a new shape that none of us had prepared for. And Rachel was the first to move, not with words, but with a small, controlled breath as she leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands folding together as if she was trying to gather the situation back into something she could manage. And Daniel remained still, the letter still in his hand, his eyes fixed on the table as though the answers might appear there if he looked long enough. And I did not rush the moment. I did not fill the space with more explanations or accusations, because everything that needed to be said had already been placed in front of them. And sometimes the most important part is what happens after the truth is introduced, the way people choose to respond when there is no longer a version of events they can comfortably believe without question. And after a long moment, Daniel spoke again, his voice quieter now, less certain, and he said, "Rachel, I think we need to understand exactly what has been going on." And it was not a demand, not yet, but it was no longer blind agreement either. And that alone marked a change that could not be undone. And Rachel looked at him, her expression measured, her voice steady but softer than before as she said, "I told you. I was trying to help. Your mother was overwhelmed. She needed support. And I stepped in." And the words were familiar, structured, carefully chosen, but now they landed differently, because they were no longer supported by unquestioned trust. And Daniel shook his head slightly, as if trying to reconcile what he had heard with what he had seen. And he said, "But signing her name, making decisions without telling her, that is not just helping." And there was something in his tone that had not been there before, something clearer, more grounded, and Rachel's composure held, but it was no longer effortless. It required attention now, and she said, "I did what I thought was best." Everything was for her benefit, and I listened, not interrupting, because this part was no longer about me explaining anything. It was about them confronting what had been done. And when the conversation paused again, I reached forward and gathered the documents slowly, stacking them with the same care I had shown from the beginning. And I said, calmly, "What matters now is not what was intended, but what has been done, and what happens next." And both of them looked at me then, really looked at me, not as someone to be managed, not as someone to be guided, but as someone who was fully present, fully aware, and fully capable of making her own decisions. And I continued, my voice steady. "I have already taken steps to secure my accounts and my records, and I have consulted with my attorney. So moving forward, nothing will be handled without my direct involvement." And I did not raise my voice. I did not emphasize the words. I simply stated them, because clarity does not need volume to be understood. And Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing that, while Rachel remained still, her expression unreadable for a moment before settling into something more reserved, more cautious. And I stood then, not abruptly, but with purpose, gathering the folder and holding it lightly at my side. And I said, "I think that is enough for today." And there was no argument, no attempt to stop me, because the direction of the conversation had already shifted beyond their control. And as I walked away from the table and toward the hallway, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something steadier, a sense that the uncertainty that had defined the beginning of this situation was no longer present, and in its place was a clear understanding of where I stood and what I would allow. And later that evening, as I sat alone in my room, the house quieter than usual, I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the small signs I had ignored, the trust one had given without question, the way control can shift so gradually that you do not notice it until it is almost complete. And I did not feel anger as I reflected on it, not in the way I might have expected, because anger would have kept me tied to what had already happened, and what mattered now was what came next. And over the following days, the changes became visible in subtle ways. Conversations were more careful. Decisions were no longer presented without explanation. Daniel asked more questions, and Rachel's confidence, while still present, was no longer absolute. And I continued as I had decided, calm, consistent, involved in every detail that concerned me, not because I needed to prove anything, but because I understood now how easily absence can be filled by someone else's intentions. And one morning, as I stood by the window with my coffee, watching the light move across the garden, I realized that nothing about the house itself had changed. The walls, the furniture, the routines were all the same, but my place within it had, not because someone had given it back to me, but because I had taken the time to see clearly, to understand fully, and to act with intention. And as I turned away from the window and set my cup down, I felt a quiet certainty settle into place, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be real, because I knew now that whatever anyone else might assume, whatever plans they might attempt to build, I would not be written out of my own life again, not quietly, not gradually, not at all. And that understanding, more than anything else, was what changed everything.